Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to wherever our audience is. Welcome to the Gulf International Forum's panel. Panel, I must say, uh, put together as an emergency on European responses to the Gulf War. Europe now confronts two overlapping, potentially existential crises. First, the energy crunch. Iran's leaders have vowed to keep the Strait of Hormuz closed, effectively halting nearly one-fifth of world oil flows. In practice, merchant shipping through the strait is nearly halted and oil is spiking. Brent crude topped $119.50 a barrel and is now settling down to a little over 100 which is still the highest in years. This spike comes just as Europe is still stabilizing from the Russian supply cutoff. European leaders remind us that in 2022 they scrapped Russian gas, diversified suppliers, and took an energy hit to prepare. But economies and budgets are all weaker now. A long blockage in the Gulf could force a 1970s style crunch. Second, Europe's defense challenge. Governments across the continent publicly say they must raise military spending dramatically. A leading industry figure warned there's an alphabet soup of projects and no clear single command. NATO's campaign for higher defense budgets has momentum, but actually building joint European forces could take years. Meanwhile, Europe's strategic freedom is constrained by geopolitics. Russia's war in Ukraine remains a priority. European security still depends on continued U.S. support for Ukraine, but now that support hinges on decisions in Washington. President Trump's recent decision to strike Iran came at least partly, I believe entirely, for domestic reasons, and so far there's no obvious off-ramp for him. Iran, having been struck, shows no signs of capitulating. In effect, Europe now faces an energy blockade and a regional war that are largely driven by the whims of foreign leaders. Public reaction in Europe is strongly against the Gulf War. In some countries, this has bolstered governments which took a cautious stance. In others, it has polarized society. In short, Europe is caught between energy insecurity, a defense gap, and limited political leverage. We can hope for a swift diplomatic break, but for now, we must manage the consequences. At the end of the day, Europe's fate may hinge as much on the unpredictable choices of leaders in Washington, Moscow, and Tehran as on anything we decide here in Brussels or Berlin. The stark reality, the need to weather a foreign-driven energy crisis and rebuild European defenses under duress is what I ask our panel to help address today. And we are lucky. We have an inordinately well-qualified panel and some very good friends. To run through them quickly, Kristian Ulrichsen is a Baker Institute Fellow for the Middle East and Senior Non-Resident Fellow for Gulf International Forum. Working across the disciplines of political science, international relations, and international political economy, his research examines the changing position of Gulf states in the global order, as well as the emergence of longer-term non-military challenges to regional security. Cinzia Bianco is a visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, where she is working on political security and economic developments in the Arabian Peninsula and Gulf region and relations with Europe. Previously, Dr. Bianco was a research fellow for the European Commission's project on EU-GCC relations, Sharaka, between 2013 and 2014. Samuel Ramani is an associate fellow at the Royal United Service Institute think tank in London, non-resident fellow at the Gulf International Forum, and the CEO of Pangea Geopolitical Risk. Samuel frequently advises the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office, the US Department of State, the Department of Defense, and NATO on defense and security issues. Now, starting off in that order, I would like to toss the first question to Dr. Ulrichsen. Sir, how is the United Kingdom assessing the current war, particularly in terms of its political, economic, and security interests in the Gulf and its long-standing partnerships with GCC states, the US, and Israel?
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Theros, and thank you to the Gulf International Forum for having this In the UK, there has been a sense of political uncertainty as to how to respond. The Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, has not wished to be a part of the Israeli military operations, offensive operations against Iran. And he has been criticized for that by the Conservative Party leadership and also by parts of the Reform Party, led by Nigel Farage, who is leading in the opinion polls, and some even say he may be in a position to form the next government after the next election in 2029. I have my doubts. Reform also has deep links with the UAE and with Dubai in particular. So there may be elements of that feeding into their criticism of the Prime Minister. Having said that, the Labour government, which has now been in power for almost 2 years, is deeply aware of the legacy of Iraq of 2003, when another Labour Prime Minister, Tony Blair, acted in lockstep with Republican President George W. Bush, went into Iraq with the US, and paid a very heavy political price in terms of Blair's political legacy, but also the legacy in the Labour Party, which turned sharply against military adventurism. And we saw that in the Labour Party electing Jeremy Corbyn as part of a backlash against what they saw as the betrayal by Tony Blair. And of course, that set Labour back. And Keir Starmer has been trying to moderate the position of the Labour Party ever since he became leader in 2020. We also saw, even in 2013, how the legacy of Iraq overshadowed the debate in the House of Commons over whether the UK should intervene in Syria when President Obama's red lines were crossed. And we saw how many members of parliament continually invoked the precedent of Iraq as a way to not get involved, as a reason to not get involved. And we still see that even today, even though Iraq now is more than 20 years behind us. So that is the overall picture which is shaping and framing the nature of the political debate in the UK at the moment. Challenge, of course, is that the UK does have incredibly close political links. Obviously, the British like to speak of the special relationship with the United States, even though perhaps the phrase is used less frequently on the other side. The Brits like to think that they should be with the US on every major issue. Tony Blair himself has made this point just last week. There is precedent in the past. Harold Wilson in the 1960s refused requests from the Johnson administration in the US to commit British forces to Vietnam. So there is precedent for the UK not to join in offensive military operations with the US. That has been invoked again over the past couple of weeks. Tony Blair's urging that the UK stands shoulder to shoulder with the US has paradoxically helped Keir Starmer, I think, because it has reminded so many people of Tony Blair's mixed legacy, a legacy which actually many people in the UK find rather toxic when it comes to the Middle East. And I think it's actually helped Keir Starmer to try and find a middle way. And what the UK's middle way has consisted of has actually been supporting its partners in the Gulf in defense. The UK has a joint squadron of Typhoon fighter jets with Qatar. It was established about 10 years ago. It has been extended beyond the World Cup. In 2022, we see UK and Qatari pilots flying together. We've seen Typhoons from the UK in the air over Qatar in the last 2 weeks, defending Qatar. They've also now expanded their operations to defend also Bahrain from missile and drone incursions. They're also active in Jordan, I think, and in Cyprus, clearly. So the UK is beginning to become more forward in its defense, in the same way that the Gulf states have been talking about forward and active defense. So drawing a distinction between that element of defensive operations and offensive operations, although they have also sent 4 additional Typhoons to the Gulf in recent days. So I think that's how they're trying to play that middle ground. It will be interesting to see how that goes forward the longer this conflict goes on. Thank you.
Yeah, you're quite right. I subscribe to a couple of British political magazines, including The Spectator, and I am amazed at I think they seriously don't think that Starmer will go to war, but that they are going to, but they're going to make his life miserable when they can, as much as they can.
Yes, that seems to be the path of the course at the moment.
Dr. Bianco, European Union perspectives. How are major European powers such as France, Germany, and Italy viewing the war? Are we seeing any divergence in their strategic priorities or policy responses towards the conflict? What's happening? Because I can't follow it.
Thank you. So I'll go straight to answer your question. I think there are actually no major divergences between European Union countries on how they look at the war and what they think about it. And perhaps with the exception of Spain, which has articulated their opposition in way clearer and stronger language. But all of the countries, even the ones that have been more sort of restrained in their criticism of the United States, they have nonetheless said that they view this war as a war of choice, and they believe that it has been an operation outside of the international law. So I think they are very broadly in agreement, and that can also be seen in the outcome of the emergency meeting between the foreign ministers of the European Union and the Gulf Cooperation Council. This emergency meeting, which happened a few days ago, resulted in a long communique where basically the Europeans were acknowledging that Gulf security is intrinsically linked to European security, in particular in terms of energy and in terms of economic security, and that there are growing relations between the Europeans and the Gulf counterparts, political, geopolitical, defense relations that they want to cultivate, and therefore they showed a lot of political vicinity to the concerns of the Gulf countries, and even in the language that they adopted, it is very, very reflective of what the Gulf countries are saying and how they are feeling about the war. So I think we have actually seen quite a unique convergence, not just among Europeans, but also between the Europeans and the Gulf actors. And this is the outcome of a few years of work on behalf of, particularly sort of the initiative has come from the Europeans, I have to say, since they published their Gulf strategy in 2022. But, you know, all of the sides have then worked on the relations. And there is now a remarkable moment of convergence. And this has been shown also operationally, because while the European Union has sort of for now maintained a political position, a few European countries, including Italy, France, and Germany, have become a bit more operationally involved. In particular, Italy and France have deployed air defense in support of their Gulf allies and partners. They are in negotiations for an expedite sharing of defense technology, beefing up the stockpiles of that are running low in Saudi Arabia and in the UAE in particular, of interceptors and other defense systems. And they have also sort of played matchmaking in the sense that they have facilitated very actively a deal between Ukraine on one side and Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates on the other, for very concrete support on behalf of Ukraine on how to intercept Iranian Shahid drones. Because as everybody knows, the Ukrainians have been subjected to a barrage of Shahid drones via Russia for years. And so they have developed a unique capability, both in terms of the kind of defense items that they produce, which are cheap interceptor drones that are very effective and are a very, very important alternative to extremely expensive US missile interceptors like the Patriots, for example. These are very, very cheap, and the Ukrainians can produce them quite quickly because obviously they are a war economy. And also in terms of the technical skills to manage these drones. And so we have already seen the Ukrainians deploy a team of technical experts to Saudi Arabia, and then they will go to the UAE and Qatar to sort of give a quick training on how to use these systems that the Ukrainians are providing. And I'm hearing that there will be further follow-up deals in that direction. So I guess this sort of sums up what the Europeans are doing, with some differences, of course, but I have to say broadly aligned.
Thank you, Dr. Bianco. A thought crossed my mind to discuss it further at the end, but a very quick question. Do the Europeans see a linkage between what Israel is doing in Lebanon and the Iran part of the war?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, yeah, because of the geopolitical link between the two theaters. But I do guess we can go more into that at the end. But I can tell you already that they are going to treat the two crises, let's call them this way, very separately. Not just because they have many of them, especially the French, special relationships with Lebanon, and so it's a special case, but just because that's the way the Europeans operate, rather than interlocking difficult geopolitical crisis, they make a big deal of measuring local realities, basically.
Dr. Ramani, we also forget that there is another shadow looming over the region, which is Russia. Russia is a close ally of Iran, and at the same time, as you know, it is supplied by Iran until this war happened, with a lot of Shahed UAVs, but has not intervened directly and abstained on the recent Security Council resolution. How does Russia view the current war? What strategic opportunities might Moscow see in the conflict, particularly in terms of energy markets, the war in Ukraine, and its broader role in the Middle East? Sammy, you're muted.
Yeah, great to be discussing this topic, and very interesting presentation so far from the British and European points of view. To start off, I wanted to kind of clarify one thing. Yes, it's commonly mentioned in the media and a lot of foreign policy circles that Russia and Iran have some kind of a special alliance or some kind of relationship. And that's often premised on the fact that Masoud Pezeshkian, the Iranian president, and the Russians did sign a comprehensive strategic partnership agreement last year, and that was honed in terms of negotiations for well over a year. I mean, they basically agreed a final form at the 2024 BRICS summit and then got it over the line quite a bit later. But in reality, Russia and Iran, in that comprehensive strategic partnership agreement, do not have any kind of mutual defense clause. It's very different from the agreement that the Russians struck with the North Koreans, where both sides would be able to obligate to intervene on each other's behalf in the event of armed aggression. That kind of promise and pledge does not really exist in the Russian-Iranian relationship, and the Russians are using that as a way out to basically justify not intervening directly on Iran's behalf in a material and a significant way. For example, this is the same policy that we saw during the 12-day war. So back in June of 2025, when Vladimir Putin was specifically probed about the question as to why aren't you providing Iran with more advanced military technology, or even refreshing Iranian air defense systems with the most modern ones, Putin responded by saying the Iranians feel like they don't really even need the most modern air defense systems from us, like the S-400s or the S-500 that they're putting under test, and that Iran's got either existing Russian defense systems and their own innovations that they trust and that they can hold and develop, even when Iranian air defense systems are being overwhelmed by Israeli and then soon American military aircraft. And that same approach of restraint, that Iran is self-sufficient, Iran can defend itself, and we don't have any obligation to really help them directly, is featuring in this war as well. And I think that the most of the Russians are going to do on Iran's behalf is basically to provide intelligence or kind of logistical support like we've been seeing coming through, helping them with targeting, helping them with movements. This is very similar to the alleged intelligence and logistical support that the Houthis received from the Russians during the attacks on maritime shipping in 2023 and 2024. I mean, the Houthis obviously wanted more than that. They wanted to get Russian arms being sourced to them. There were rumors even that Victor Bout, after he was released from prison, was involved in sourcing those arms. And many Russian ultranationalist commentators like Sergei Mardan, who are one of the leading cheerleaders for the Russia-Iran alliance, wanted Russia to supply devastating anti-ship missiles or long-range missiles as retaliation for ATACMS going to Ukraine, but Russia didn't do that, and that same restraint is holding here. Russia maintains a clear policy of flexible diplomacy in the region. It's a friends with all, enemies of none kind of allies of none approach, which allows them to manipulate relationships with different powers. That has been challenged since 2023 a little bit because Russia has been so critical of Israel's conduct in Gaza and has leaned towards pro-Palestinian narratives to attract global South support and keep the global South on side and to keep the global South and the West divided. But Russia is very, very invested in maintaining strong relationships with all of the Gulf countries, especially its strategic partnership with the UAE, which is probably its most important in the Gulf region and the most far-reaching. We've seen Mohammed bin Zayed and Putin speak to other GCC leaders as well. And Saudi Arabia and Russia also have close engagements that need to be held, not just in OPEC Plus, but also in terms of how they see international security. When I was engaging with Saudi officials and experts just a couple of weeks ago, I was hearing a lot of expressions of sympathy for Russia's involvement in Ukraine, comparisons between, how they dealt with the NATO threat and NATO provocation to their own concerns about provocations from Iran, the UAE, and Yemen, and even Saudi indigenous defense technology people talking about how the Russian war economy could be a model for their own development. So there's clearly a wide-ranging partnership with the Saudis that they want to maintain too. And they've got LNG partnerships with Qatar and investments in the Qatari Investment Authority, potentially, in the Arctic if the Chinese don't step in, and even a productive and smaller, but a more important partnership with Oman, where some Russians who don't want to live in Dubai are going there. So the Russians want to maintain even-handed relationships. They're going to stay out of this, and they see themselves as beneficiaries because of rising oil prices and because America's in a quagmire. Andrew Keelan's statement today, the Russian ambassador to Britain, that the U.S. doesn't have an end game to exit Iran, is not just a statement of the empirical situation. It's also what they're rooting for. That the Americans get stuck in Iran, get stuck in the Middle East, interceptors that are supposed to go to Ukraine go elsewhere, oil sanctions get lifted for a long time, and Russia then finally gains ground in Donetsk, Dnipropetrovsk, and Zaporizhia, and can sue for negotiations with Ukraine later on much more favorable terms than they can do now. So Russia sees this as an unlikely geopolitical opportunity. They're trying to act like an elder statesman, engaging with all the GCC countries and Iran, but they're not going to support Iran. They're going to let this play out and deal with the cards as they're being dealt in a favorable way.
Sammy, really good presentation. Quick question. Do you think the Russians are coordinating their policies on the region with China, for example?
Well, I mean, there's been some anecdotal reports that the Russians and the Chinese are providing complementary satellite imagery or like logistical signals intelligence and assistance. There was a good article I saw in Al Jazeera about the war of signals, right? That was talking about Russia and China basically in the same breath. But I think that, China obviously and Russia have very different interests here. I mean, China is obviously heavily dependent on this region for energy exports, so it does not thrive on disruption. Russia has a much higher tolerance for disruption and destabilization in the region. Moreover, Russia's got an ultra-nationalist contingent that it needs to appease in terms of kind of supporting Iran to some extent. I mean, the ultra-nationalists who were critical of how the war was being conducted, they want a war economy, they want, full mobilization, like the supporters of Prigozhin and Girkin back in the day when those people were not dead or in prison. They are very strongly supportive of Iran. They see the Iranian cause an axis of resistance against Israel as an anti-imperial struggle they should get behind in like neo-Soviet terms. So the Russians have to pander to that domestic constituency too. So that's why they're more in the tank with Iran, as well as their tolerance for disruption. China doesn't have those kind of domestic cleavages that Russia has. That's why I don't think that there's really a Sino-Russian axis here in this conflict.
Question for all of any of the panelists. Recently, I've been seeing news reports that there are European states, France in particular, or perhaps Germany, who claim or have been reported as stating that they will send naval vessels to provide escorts through the Straits of Hormuz. From a practical point of view, I don't know if I would risk $1 billion frigate or destroyer in those particular narrow waters. But does anybody think these are really serious offers? They are desperate, of course. Cinzia?
Yeah, I do think they are serious offers, because it's not just about desperation. It is about the recognition that in many European capitals, and in particular France, which was the country that was spearheading this idea, and to a certain extent also in Germany and Italy, the recognition that we are in a different world. It is no longer a liberal world where the geopolitics is secondary to international relations and international law, but actually we are in a world where you have to show strength in a much stronger way than before, and we are seeing all of the European countries going through this, deep rethinking of their behavior on the international chessboard, including a greater willingness to show muscle where they think it is needed. So in terms of risking, a major incident, definitely there is this chance. The idea that French President Emmanuel Macron launched, I think, either in coordination with U.S. President Trump, or that the President Trump then quickly sort of relaunched the idea, is to have an international coalition, not just a French or an Italian or an American force, but to have an international coalition to kind of basically force the block of the Strait of Hormuz through the sheer opposition of coordinated political will, let's say, from different players around the world. Whether that will be successful or not, I have my doubts. But I guess that is the thinking behind the choice.
Remarkable. I was expecting you to say that it probably wouldn't happen, so I was wrong on that. Kristian, how do you see the British willingness to participate more actively in the Gulf, and the same way as Cinzia said?
Yes, I think especially the more that the conflict generates blowback against the Gulf states, this will become politically easier for the UK to step up its involvement if it can be justified on the basis of defending close partners in the Gulf against these retaliatory attacks, both in terms of the air cover, which we mentioned before, but also in terms of potentially British contributions to naval patrols and to some of the convoys which may be planned. And of course, the UK has done that since the 1980s as well, in the Iran-Iraq War too. So there's a long-standing precedent, and there are British military assets in several of the Gulf states, which would be, I think, would look odd from a Gulf partner point of view, were these assets not to be utilized in such a time of need. So I think framing it in those terms will be something that the Starmer government will use to gradually deepen Britain's involvement. And again, in terms of also showing of intelligence, the UK-Oman relationship is absolutely critical in that respect. And I suspect that the UK and Omani officials are in constant dialogue, both about sharing ideas about how to move forward and how to support Oman's attempts to mediate, or at least find a way to get a resolution to this conflict. I think those are the most likely points for Britain to follow. There are some capacity issues, I think, especially with the Royal Navy at the moment. A lot of ships seem to be either in maintenance or out of action for the time being. I think we're seeing maybe the legacy of also 15 years now of defense cuts, of austerity measures. Britain simply can't sort of punch above its weight in ways that even they could do in 2003, when there was a sizable contingent of British military forces that contributed to the Iraq, the coalition. So I think we're seeing the sort of downsizing of Britain's ability to project force, which will now come under pressure. And as both Cinzia and Sam have said as well, there's also the question of Ukraine, which hovers in the background. And Britain has been one of the most supportive backers of the Ukrainian fight against the Russian invasion since 2012, a full-scale Russian invasion since 2022. And so there will be, of course, questions about how to coordinate support now for Ukraine, while also maintaining support for the Gulf. So I think these are potentially going to overstretch some of Britain's capabilities. One thing I think that it will also do is encourage a intensification of the debate in the UK as to the degree to which Britain should repair its relationships with the European Union, draw closer to the European Union on certain issues, including defence, because of course it's coming up to 10 years in June since the referendum to leave the European Union. A lot of the animosity of that time has dissipated, and a lot of the assumptions made in 2016 that Britain could sort of stand alone and be a sort of middle power between the US on the one side, the EU on the other, is now also called into question by the fact that we are now in such a more dangerous situation, both with Ukraine, the Russian situation, obviously, and now in the Gulf, but also with the sheer unpredictability of the US administration, and one that doesn't seem to be always acting in the best interest of its partners and allies. And of course, the UK is one of the closest allies of the US. But then there were questions about NATO, and of course the US commitment to NATO, and then the questions over Greenland in recent months. So I think all of these issues are going to be feeding into debates at the very highest level, involving the UK Prime Minister, the service chiefs, as to how the UK can act within its means and to best project the ability to defend its partners in the Gulf, but not at the expense of the commitments that the UK already has. So I think that's going to be something that will dominate debate the longer this conflict goes on. It's already been longer than the 12-day war in June 2025, and it's going to overstretch Britain's capabilities. And so there may well have to be a discussion about what is most realistic going forward.
Along these lines, very quick question, again, Kristian. How does British public opinion see the potential for, or political opinion, I should say, not public opinion, how do they see the potential for an intervention in the Gulf on British side? Would that help Starmer, or would that hurt him politically?
I think if it were defensive in nature, it would not necessarily hurt Starmer politically. Both the opposition, both the Conservatives and Reform, which is clearly a very small party in terms of seats, but clearly is much greater in terms of its ability to influence the political spectrum. Both of them would, I think, be supportive of a more forward defensive posture. So I think it's more of an issue of capability. I think political and public opinion is very much critical of the US-Israeli war of choice. It's clearly seen as a war of choice and not a war that was necessary. But of course, the longer the Iranian attacks on partners in the Gulf go on, the easier it will be to frame, easier politically it will be to frame these measures as defense in support of critical partners, energy partners, security and defense partners, and political partners. So that will probably help Starmer going forward.
Overall, a key question in my mind is, how vulnerable is Europe actually to this stoppage? Can Europe adjust its partners? Can they find other alternatives, or anything within a reasonable period of time? How soon, in your opinion, does this get to be not quite an existential crisis? That's an exaggeration, but a crisis beyond the ability of European governments to cope with in a normal way, plunging the countries into very serious economic problems? Anybody of this?
Sam, unless you want to take it.
You can go first, and if I have anything to add, I might just compliment it.
All right, sounds good. I mean, I think, it is in every crisis, every global crisis, we somehow end up talking about whether these will be existential for the European economies. And my answer is always that the EU economic death is always reports of our death is always exaggerated. And in fact, I think so. definitely the numbers are concerning, but the European countries per se do not depend on Gulf oil or on Gulf gas. They do have important strategic agreements, both with Qatar for LNG and with Saudi and UAE. But the lessons from the 2022 energy crisis, when they had to shift very, very rapidly away from what was an actual dependence on Russian oil and gas, was that you must always diversify and you must always have plan B and plan C. A little bit like the Chinese, who they actually depend on Saudi oil and on Qatari LNG, but they also have diversified and prepared for a rainy day with a lot of strategic storage in their own country and in the vicinity. Similarly, Europeans have prepared for potential new disruptions because of the lessons of the Russian crisis. And the disruption to trade and to supply chains, which is definitely relevant, is going to come, I guess, still in a couple of weeks. We can still do for a couple of weeks, because Hormuz in particular threatens trade towards Asia. And then not all of the cargo, or actually quite a smaller percentage of the cargo coming from Europe to Asia or the other way around, actually stops to go into Hormuz. That would be a slight detour, which is convenient somehow because Dubai is a hub and so on, but not all of the cargoes go that way. So I guess, to go straight to your answer, I think 2 or 3 weeks should be still in manageable territory.
Yeah.
Sammy.
Yeah, there's a couple of comments on that. Yeah, I basically agree with what you're saying over here. I also agree that the Russian experience does provide a prototype for how Europe didn't freeze in the winter, and the Russians weren't able to weaponize winter against Western Europe anywhere near like the way they were unfortunately able to do it against the Ukrainians through electrical strikes. But yeah, like I think that the EU strategic reserve shouldn't be underestimated. Yeah, 2 to 3 weeks is definitely feasible. I mean, I've actually seen, 85 to 90 days being the kind of mandated minimum. So obviously, in the latter part of that, stretch, there's going to be people getting squeamish and people getting concerned. But unless the war runs massively over what Trump's even 4 to 5 week timetable is, it's probably going to be okay. Europe doesn't need that much Gulf oil or LNG. I mean, I think Qatar only provides 8% of the LNG total. The U.S. is a key supplier. I mean, there's also Norwegian gas, there's Algerian gas, there's renewable energy that's kicking up. And yeah, I mean, the U.S. can basically do some limited rerouting also from Asia to Europe, which I think is helpful as well. But the terminals are also hitting key capacity. So that reroute is only a partial fix. And in general, the other key thing that we need to keep in mind is that Gulf oil is more than just Hormuz, right? If the Red Sea oil that we're seeing rapidly increase from the Saudi point of view, 1.1 million barrels a day to 2.2 million barrels a day coming from that area continues, the UAE can still, even in spite of the Iranian attacks near it, keep that Fujairah, Habshan kind of area going. Then there'll still be some oil entering the system from the Gulf also. So, and oil is basically 3 times as much in terms of imports, percentage-wise, than Qatari LNG. So I think that overall, Europe's got strategic reserves. There are other suppliers. This isn't an imminent crisis unless the war really drags out well beyond Trump's timetable. And that would probably mean that there's ground forces being deployed or a mining of Hormuz or something more serious, which isn't, necessarily inevitable, hopefully, at this point.
You brought up the damage to the facilities. I was frankly surprised and happy that I was surprised, because I do know that the Iranians prior to the war and over the years have been threatening to attack the Gulf states, the GCC states' export facilities on the grounds that this is an asymmetrical response to a major American and or Israeli attack. Well, now they've got a major and or Israeli attack in spades on steroids, and still there's been very little damage done, relatively speaking, to the actual facilities, which would change the whole equation, because it would take years to rebuild after a major attack. Do you see any chance, from your point of view, that the war might escalate in that direction? And if so, why? Any of the three?
I mean, there is a risk. There is a risk that the Iranians, if they face backs against the wall existential risk that they see, maybe from enhanced or intensified Israeli bombardment, if the Israelis feel that Trump wants out and they have to go all in for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and the Iranian leadership decides to escalate, then certainly they could make an attempt to overwhelm some of the energy facilities with drone strikes, especially that some on the basis that one or two could get through. We saw the strike on the refinery in Oman, how quick, how much that could do in terms of damage. And as you say, I mean, so far we haven't seen that. Obviously, attacks on desalination plants have also been much spoken about. And of course, I mean, a nightmare, kind of black swan event as well would be if the Houthi in Yemen decide to get involved in a major way, either because they're being pressured to by Iran or because they feel that they have to engage. If they were to start resumptions of attacks against Yanbu and the Red Sea coast of Saudi Arabia, that would really put a double bind on some of the flows to the pipelines that we've just spoken about. Now, hopefully that won't happen, but there are still escalatory risks. We've already seen an attempted attack on Fujairah in the UAE, which is their hub for the end of their pipeline. So certainly if the Iranians decide to hit the sort of energy choke points like they did in 2019 at Abqaiq with Saudi Arabia, if they chose to do that again and were successful, that would add a whole new layer of chaos and risk and long-term, well, certainly damage to the equation.
Yeah, just I agree with that. But basically, effectively, what happened with Abqaiq is an interesting precedent, right? It had the output from that facility at one point in time temporarily, and there were also several months of repairs that were kind of needed. In general, what we've really seen so far is yes, the capacity from Iran to seriously damage or cause disruption around gas fields, especially some of the key ones in Qatar, like Ras Laffan. The ports of Salalah and Duqm were having some serious disruptions, particularly Salalah with the carrier tankers. Saudi Aramco facilities like Ras Tanura, they had the fire. But the thing is, even more than actually physically or technically destroying these apparatuses in the long term with drone swarms or with attacks, because air defense systems can counter that, what they can do is cause massive outsized disruption in terms of production capability. So even if debris falls in the direction, there's a prolonged closure, there's a prolonged shutdown, there's a prolonged slowdown. So I think that the biggest damage that the Iranians can still do is near-term production, near-term supply chain shocks, and that's how they're going to be still targeting and acting, rather than fully degrading or destroying immense, widely dispersed infrastructure, because they can cause outsized shocks or production cuts that way exceed the level of damage they actually inflict. And that's kind of an important thing too.
One thought that occurred to me at the same time was that the longer you close down an oil or gas facility, the more difficult, the more time it needs to start up. You have to go and check all the valves, all the fittings, everything, just to make sure that it all works a lot. So we may be in for a longer crisis, even if the fighting stops. In the meantime, is there signs that the Europeans are pushing Trump, or they can't get up their courage to push him to declare victory and go home?
I guess they are involved in encouraging diplomatic off ramp to the conflict. They are coordinating with Gulf countries, Gulf monarchies in particular, who are also pushing the same ideas, in particular Oman and Qatar. But in terms of making it a priority in their engagement of Trump, it is a different. It is a different thing, because I mean, Europeans have a lot to discuss with Trump, and so they have to prioritize And, as we were discussing, yes, definitely the Iran war is a major crisis, but it is not as existential for them as, for example, the war in Ukraine. And we know that European countries and the EU have differences with Trump there. It is not as directly a threat to their economic security as some of the tariffs and trade war that Trump wanted to launch on them could be. So they are engaging Trump in coordination and in cooperation with regional players, but this is not, I would say, the number one priority of issues that they need to get Trump on board with, especially because European governments are somehow convinced that Trump is looking for a quick way out. And so they might be encouraging him to find one or find the way to declare victory and go home. But nobody thinks that Trump is actually in for a long war. They don't believe that it's his intention.
I hope you're right about that, with the Europeans are right about that. Another issue that has come up in some discussions right now, having declared the UAE and Qatar, and who's declared force majeure so far on exports? It's been the UAE, Qatar, and Bahrain, I believe. Is that correct?
I think Kuwait as well, the Kuwait Petroleum Corporation.
Yeah, which means that essentially the biggest part, what sustains the governments of this region, which is energy exports, has just been stopped or has taken a huge hit. And they still got to keep things going. I mean, you still have to pay government salaries. You have to keep projects open. You have to keep the water desalination plants going. There's all sorts of things that need managing. You have to manage the fact that parts of your economy have stopped, so you've got to make up for it, like the airlines aren't flying. On my Qatar Airways feed, I got this. We are not going to take anybody in transit through Doha going to the Far East. This is now the new thing. So they're going to have to start dipping into their other sources of money, just as the Kuwaitis did in 1991. The Sovereign Wealth Fund pretty much kept the Kuwaiti government, which didn't have a lot of expenses because it was in exile, but it kept the Kuwaiti government functioning. Right now, there are huge demands on the finances of the Gulf states. And and this may not be a question, but if it is for Europe, so much of Gulf investment is in Europe. Do you see that the Europeans are worried that you might start seeing the sovereign wealth funds beginning to borrow money, to disinvest, to start getting out of the more easily dumpable projects?
Yeah, just to give an overview of that, because I was just in the UAE right before all this happened and talking with people adjacent to in the sovereign wealth fund space. One quick thing: there's been an interesting approach to how the UAE has taken it vis-a-vis Bahrain, Kuwait, and Qatar on the force majeure issue. ADNOC has actually tried to avoid declaring a direct force majeure because they're still trying to frame themselves as being able to manage these disruptions on a case-by-case basis. So they're cutting offshore production to deal with storage. They're kind of basically doing some temporary shutdowns in relation to fires, a little bit of precautionary cuts. Like, for example, if they're worried about something being struck, they might trim 10% or 20% of the production, rerouting through Gulf of Oman, the Fujairah route. Probably the UAE, based on what I've been engaging with people there, will have to follow suit on the force majeure issue fully if the Strait of Hormuz remains closed for a long time. But that's not really how they do it. There's a slight difference in how they handle that particular issue from a legal perspective. I just wanted to bring that up. With regards to the sovereign wealth funds, yes, I think that there is already a review of sovereign wealth fund spending that's being enacted by the Saudi PIF, by Mubadala, by the Qatar Investment Authority in a broad way. Europe is a key destination for them because they're heavily involved in not just oil trade, obviously, but in advanced technology. So AI is significant. I mean, you've got Mubadala getting into the green hydrogen sphere. You've got a lot of renewable energy partnerships that are coming forward here in Britain, in Germany, and many other places. So, yeah, a lot of those things will have to be considered and be rethought about. And that's a major blow at a time when Europe is really wanting to get more investment from diverse sources and trying to get in. Also, Europe was seen by many of the Gulf sovereign wealth funds as an area that was kind of a stable, more high return, reliable return area. So this is the question. As they do the review, do they scale back massively from Europe and keep their investments elsewhere, or do they scale back less from Europe and more elsewhere? I'm guessing that what might actually take the initial hit is not necessarily European investment, but the ongoing growing heat up of in investments in Africa that's been going on, where the Saudi PIF has been getting a lot more muscular in order to confront the UAE after that Sudan gold deal and the Somalia strategic partnership deal during their whole rift. So the Saudis might be kind of wavering a little bit there. I'm also hearing some rumblings that even in strategically important areas like rare earth metals and on relatively low cost projects in higher risk sub-Saharan African countries, the QIA and the PIF and Madden and others are getting a bit wavering. So I think that, there will be a review holistically of the sovereign wealth fund operations, but Europe, because of its stability of returns, may actually see a slightly lower cut than some of the newer and more and very intense pre-war theaters of concentration like sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah, I also suspect that one of the things we should be looking at is if the Gulf states begin to cut back investments in the United States. I think that would be an indication of they're either putting pressure on Trump, or that they've simply decided that Trump is hopeless, and they're going to put some distance between themselves and the states. Any comments on that?
I mean, that's probably their biggest point of leverage in the Gulf at the moment. The fact that collectively they've pledged more than $3 trillion of investments into the US. Now, many of those are still pledges. They are going to unfold over years, but they still have been used. They have fed into, obviously, the president's America First approach, and it's a point of leverage. In the Gulf, they will maybe be thinking about trying to tap. Certainly, we've seen precedent in the 2008-2009 period when we had the global financial crisis. We saw assets being used domestically from some of the sovereign wealth funds to support struggling local financial institutions. Obviously, you mentioned, Ambassador, the precedent of Kuwait in 1990-91, not only during the invasion itself, but then financing the reconstruction of Kuwait too. And of course, my boss here at the Baker Institute, James Baker, was very proud of the fact that the US didn't really contribute financially to the costs of the liberation of Kuwait. It was borne by partners in the Gulf. So there are those precedents. So already we've seen PIF increasing its allocation of resources domestically as a proportion of total assets. So yeah, I would imagine that this is the next step the Gulf leaders will try to think about, how to leverage the US, sort of Donald Trump, using the language that Trump seems to understand, which is the language of finance, the language of money, and the image of maybe losing some of those massive pledges that he was so happy to talk about during his visit to the region in May last year.
I was in Central Command. I went Central Command shortly after the Kuwait War, and you're quite right. Central Command's accounting, it wasn't a political accounting, but just that what did they actually spend? We came away with the conclusion that we made a slight but not insignificant profit of about $8 billion on the war itself. Going back to things that go boom in the night, there was a solitary or more than solitary missile attack on the British sovereign base area in Cyprus. This raises two questions for me. One is, was it a deliberate, coordinated attack, or just one decentralized part of the Iranian system that fired missiles at Cyprus? And two, this raises other issues because Greece, by reinforcing Cyprus, has sent aircraft and frigates there, has provoked a new crisis with Turkey. And France apparently is also, as well, probably Greece's best ally within the EU, is also deploying forces to Cyprus, just as Turkey is threatening to do. I don't know if they've actually gone through with it at all. How does that affect Europe? How is that viewed in Europe? And could the Iranians stir things up more by tossing a few more missiles at the sovereign base area or even at a Cypriot target? Yeah.
Yes, yeah, I think this was it is, when Europeans talk about the war in Iran, they all mention the attack against the base in Cyprus and all of the repercussions the EU ambassador were enumerating, and there is concern that this could trigger a new round of tensions between Greece and Turkey, or Greece, France, and Turkey. But at the same time, I'm also hearing that that there is a shared priority, which is to de-escalate the situation rather than add further fuel to the fire. And so, for example, Europeans are conscious of the fact that Turkey has its own channel with Iran and with the Americans, and they are doing diplomatic work to try and de-escalate. And that the Turks also are intercepting Iranian projectiles launched at them. So I guess these tensions are bubbling, but the prevailing situation right now is that everyone is trying to keep the temperature low. And I'm very conscious that we only have 4 minutes left, so I'll leave it at that.
Okay. All right. Well, at 4 minutes, let me just start off with a question, a closing question that also includes a question I wanted to ask. Is there much talk in Europe about new refugee flows coming out of the region, out of Iran? But in general, as we sort of make the rounds of all three of you, who sees an off-ramp, and what do you think the off-ramp might be to bring this war to a close? Kristian, you're first.
Well, I think the off-ramp will be President Trump signaling more so than he's done, because he's been a bit all over the place in some of his comments, contradicting himself even in the same sentence on occasions in his press conferences, which make it even more difficult to try and figure out what he's trying to say. But if he were to signal very clearly that the US is wrapping this up, then there would be a space, I think, for other actors to try to ensure that Israel also aligns with the US, and that there's dialogue with Iran to ensure that the Iranians don't continue to make the region and the global economy held hostage just because they can feel that this is payback time for what has happened to them. So the off-ramp will be, I think, led by the US, and we have to get to that point very soon, I think.
Cinzia?
I want to go in a different direction and sort of throw a little bit of a more creative scenario. I think what might happen is that Benjamin Netanyahu himself calls it a day and declares victory, because he only has a few days left until he can constitutionally call for early elections. And that's something he wants to do because he wants to reap off the political benefits that he thinks he will be reaping off of Israel's adventurism around the region. And so he might and to do that, he must do that in a time of peace. So we might be surprised and see that Netanyahu declares victory, closes the war or this round of the war, and then calls for early elections.
Fascinating. I had not thought of that at all. You're quite right. Samuel?
Yeah, I think that pretty much Trump came into this war with a bit of a big underestimation, right? Like he kind of figured that basically killing the Ayatollah, decapitating the senior leader would lead to the collapse of the Islamic Republic, neglecting the many layers within the clerical IRGC and various other organs of the state. He was basically, I do agree with the reports that this is kind of a manifestation of intelligence failure, like equivalent to almost what Russia expected to see happen in Ukraine, or what he thought a repeat of Venezuela happening again. So I think that the combination of when it becomes clear that ground forces are the only way to dislodge the regime, and the economic costs and the stock market costs become prohibitively high, he's probably going to declare victory in some form and justify that victory by highlighting the destruction of nuclear, ballistic missile, naval, and other assets. Already talking about more than 50 major naval assets from Iran being decapitated, 6,000 targets being hit. be even more damage to nuclear facilities than what we've seen in June. So I think that there is a possibility that Trump will climb down. And I think that in general, the idea, at least coming from Washington, is that Trump and Israel will work this out and coordinate this together and end together. So Israel will not continue unilaterally. It'll be a climb down similar to what we saw in the June war, except obviously after a much messier set of consequences.
Well, I hope there is a climb down. I hope that the off ramp is signaling, here I am and take me. My one concern would be that the Israeli tendency to then say that there's been violations of the ceasefire or something, and try and continue it. But Cinzia, you think that that would not be possible for Israel to continue bombing after it declared that it was over on a small scale?
No, I think it could be possible, but they could do that more easily in Lebanon, I think, with less global consequences and preserving also their alignment with Trump. But again, mine is a bit of a creative scenario, so let's see if that actually takes place.
Well, for your mouth to the ears of God, as they say. Thank you all very much for this part. For participating, for sharing your thoughts and your ideas with us. We are facing a crisis that, if not existential, is going to be pretty painful for the world economy, if not brought to an end fairly quickly. Thank you all for participating, and we'll hopefully see you the next time.
Thank you.